Okay, welcome everyone. I think we better get started. We have a lot to cover today. I see people are still flowing in, but we're going to start with some housekeeping so they won't miss too much. My name is Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. We're delighted to have you with us today for the fourth session in our Reducing Scope 3 Emissions webinar series. Today, we're going to be looking at categories 4 and 9 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's Corporate Value Chain Accounting and Reporting Standard, and that covers transportation and distribution. We're really grateful that our series partners, Shoesmiths, Owen Mumford, and PA Consulting, were able to support this series, and we thank them enormously for that. Before we get going, just a bit of housekeeping. We are in webinar mode today, and that means we won't be able to hear from you, our audience, out loud, and we won't be able to see you, but we still do want your interventions and your participation. And there's two ways that we're looking for you to do that. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a chat function, and already we're seeing lots of action in there, and we hope there'll be more. We'll certainly be putting in lots of links to relevant content as we go along, and we certainly welcome your comments there as we go. But we do not welcome questions there because we have a Q&A box for that. And so if you have a question that you'd like us to discuss with the panelists, please look to the Q&A box that's also at the bottom of your screen. And when you open that, in the top right-hand corner, you will see an option of how you want the Q&A ordered. It defaults, I think, to most recent, but if you click on most upvotes, then you'll see probably the most likely order in which we'll be addressing the questions. And the upvotes is your opportunity to influence what we're going to be talking about today. If you click and give a thumbs up to a question that you're really keen on having an answer to, that will most definitely improve the likelihood that we'll be able to present that to our esteemed panelists and discuss it. A final bit of housekeeping: we've got captions turned on. So if you want the captions turned on, again, at the bottom of your screen, I think where the three dots are, there are options there for you to turn that on if you would like. But just please note that that's all automatic, and any spelling or grammar mistakes are not down to us. And apologies if the AI produces something rude or inappropriate. Okay, I think that's it for housekeeping. So let's move on to the next slide, which, really sad to say, has become almost further housekeeping, but it's an absolutely essential message that we feel we need to just keep hammering away at. We've been showing this slide at every webinar we've done since the war began, and it is really disturbing when we have to update those numbers every time, and just how rapidly they are growing. There are now at least 5.3 million Ukrainian refugees that have crossed the borders seeking safety into neighboring countries. There's another 7.7 million people displaced within Ukraine. Not in living memory have we seen these kinds of numbers of refugees at such a pace. The crisis is acute. Any support that you or your companies can provide to help these people would really make a big difference. My colleagues have put in the chat some links to a guide on how business can support humanitarian efforts, also links to the UNHCR. If you're able to donate funds, or even better, materials, do please follow up and do everything that you possibly can to help. Okay, let's go on to our next slide then, please. A bit more housekeeping. For those of you that are not yet familiar with the UN Global Compact, we are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. We have over 15,000 companies around the world and another 4,000 non-business organizations that have made the commitment to our 10 principles to support sustainability. These universal principles are derived from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. They are truly global and universal. Here at the UK Network, our mission is to turn this global momentum on sustainability into practical action. We have 3 main work streams: business and human rights, climate action, and global goals. And we deliver more than 100 events a year to support our members and, like today, the wider business community here in the UK. To join the UN Global Compact, if you're not already participating, I would really encourage you to look into it. Your CEO needs to commit to three key pieces. Firstly, to operationalize the Global Compact principles throughout your organization. Secondly, to report annually on the progress you're making towards that end. And finally, to support the wider UN development agenda. And at the moment, that wider agenda is best represented by the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, and now we can move on to today. So as I said, we're going to be talking about Scope 3 emissions and specifically categories 4 and 9. We have a fantastic group of speakers. First, we're going to hear from Olwen Smith. She's the global lead for the Commit to Action program at CDP, and she's also I suppose seconded, Olwen, you can correct me, to the Science Based Targets Initiative. And she's going to kick off the proceedings with some information about setting a science-based targets and how you reconcile that with Scope 3. Then we're going to hear from Andrew Davenport, the head of Distribution Zone Europe for Nestlé. And finally, from Oliver Hurrey, founder and chair of the Scope 3 peer group. Andrew and Oliver will give brief presentations, and then we're going to get into the Q&A. We should have lots of time to take your questions. So please do put them into the Q&A box. Please do keep an eye on the Q&A box and vote for the questions that you're most keen to have us answer. Don't put questions in the chat. We are not able, as moderators, to put questions into the Q&A. So if you put it into the chat, we're not being lazy when we ask you to move it to the Q&A. We can't do it for you. We need you to do that. So do please try and keep that straight. Okay, one final slide, I think, from me before we get going. There's a lot of text on there, but ultimately what it boils down to, between categories 4 and 9, basically all of the emissions from third-party transportation companies for inbound or outbound goods are covered. And so that's what we want to talk about today, is how you can reduce and better measure those emissions. I know I've cut some big corners in summing it up that way, but that's just, I think, I hope you agree I'm doing you a service by not just reading out that whole slide. And we'll get stuck into some of the nuances as we go along. And I see a link has just flashed up for where you can find out some more. Also, so more links on the series I see in the chat. This, as I said, is the 4th of 9 webinars that we're doing as part of our Scope 3 emissions series. We'll be looking at some of the other categories in the weeks ahead, and the categories that we've already looked at, you'll be able to find recordings of those webinars on our website. Okay, I think with that, I am very happy to hand over to Olwen to get us started. Olwen.
Many thanks, Steve, and thank you to the UNGC UK Network for having me today. Delighted to be here. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to setting targets through the SBTi, focusing particularly on Scope 3 target setting and touching on these two categories, 4 and 9. So if we can go on to the next slide, I'll begin with a brief introduction to the SBTi, or the Science-Based Targets Initiative, for those that are less familiar with it. It's an initiative which was founded in 2015 by 4 founding partner organizations, of which CDP is one. And there's also the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And it was founded with the aim of driving ambitious corporate climate action by enabling companies to set targets that are based on the latest climate science. And as the numbers on the right-hand side of the slide here illustrate, the initiative has had very strong traction, particularly over the last year or two. There's now almost 2,900 companies setting targets through the SBTi, and that equates to over 35% of the world's market capitalization. So these are some of the largest companies globally included. And science-based targets have really emerged as a kind of gold standard when it comes to target setting. So we're increasingly seeing stakeholders like investors and corporate purchasing customers asking their portfolio companies or their suppliers to have these robust and credible targets in place. So on to the next slide, I'll just briefly explain what a science-based target is. It is a corporate emissions reductions target that's in line with the level of decarbonisation that the latest climate science tells us is necessary to meet the Paris Agreement and stay within 1.5 degree of warming. So putting it more simply, SBTs help a company to determine how much and how fast they need to reduce their emissions. Quickly then on the time frame of targets, there are near-term science-based targets, and they span 5 to 10 years. There's actually a small typo on this slide, unfortunately. Or there's also longer-term or net zero science-based targets, and they are kind of a newer type of target that have just been around since the Science-Based Targets Initiative started validating net zero targets at the beginning of 2022. So on to the next slide, and I'll dive into the Scope 3 element. The Science-Based Targets Initiative acknowledges that there are certain challenges when it comes to Scope 3. I think everyone is well aware of that. The challenges, range from availability of accurate primary data to also understanding and using levers of reduction across your value chain. And with that in mind, then the SBTi does provide a bit more flexibility when it comes to target setting for Scope 3 when compared to Scope 1 and 2. I'll just highlight some of those key parts and elements of flexibility. The first is that companies need to initially do a screening to understand whether their Scope 3 emissions constitute at least 40% of the total corporate footprint. And if that 40% threshold is surpassed, then the company does need to set a Scope 3 target through the SBTi. And this is the vast majority of companies. But if your Scope 3 emissions are not more than 40% of total emissions in the near term, you don't need to set a science-based target for Scope 3. Then on the boundary side, companies must include at least 2/3 or 67% of their Scope 3 emissions in their near-term science-based target, but that means they can exclude up to 1/3. So again, allowing for a bit of flexibility. And then finally, the last point I'd highlight here is that there are a variety of target setting methods available for Scope 3 through the SBTi, which I'll touch on now in a couple of slides. So if we move on to the next slide, and just briefly to mention a difference between the near-term and long-term science-based targets when it comes to Scope 3. So the SBTi takes what we call an expansive boundary approach here, whereby at the net zero or long-term point, companies will need to have a 90% target boundary or coverage for Scope 3. So it's increasing from the 2/3 in the near term up to 90% in the long term. And that's because, it's necessary to have a very comprehensive target boundary to make a credible net zero claim at this kind of end of the decarbonisation journey. But as I've already mentioned earlier on, there's that bit more flexibility to exclude 1/3. On to the next slide then, and touching on these different types of target setting methods that I said were available. In the interests of time, I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but just to highlight, this is again one bucket of type of Scope 3 target that can be set, which are emissions reductions target. And there's 3 key types, being absolute reduction, economic intensity, or physical intensity, that are accepted for Scope 3. It's also possible to set a sector-specific intensity target, and I'll touch on that specifically for these categories in a moment. But we'll move on to the next slide first, and just I'll mention the other type of scope 3 targets that can be set, and these are engagement targets. And so this is whereby a company is committing to having a certain percentage of either customers or suppliers, it's much more frequently suppliers, to have set their own science-based targets within a 5-year window. And we are seeing these becoming increasingly popular. I think about 15% of companies with approved science-based targets have set some kind of engagement target. And just to say, yeah, so I guess to conclude a bit on the target setting approaches there, because scope 3 is complex, you have your different categories, you have your different levers of reductions across the value chain. Companies can choose to set just one scope 3 target or a combination of scope 3 targets using the various approaches, as long as these 2/3 of emissions are included within the one or multiple targets. And then onto the next slide, which is honing in on these two specific categories of transport and distribution, category 4 and 9, and a few particular points on target setting for these. So firstly, companies must cover well-to-wheel emissions in their target boundary if they're setting transport-related targets. So using a very holistic approach that covers the entire energy consumption and all GHG emissions of a fuel. On to then the next point here on scope 3 methods. As I've already outlined, there is this variety of methods available, but particularly for these two categories, it is possible to use the Science Based Targets Initiative's sectoral decarbonisation approaches for transport and aviation. So if you had freight that was road or rail, it would be the transport tool. If it was air freight, you could use the aviation tool. And that would mean you'd be setting an intensity target following those sector pathways. So much more detail available in those guidance documents linked. And then one final note, just to say that offsetting using carbon credits isn't permitted to achieve any near-term science-based target for any of these categories. So one last slide then on the kind of target setting and these categories. And I think to Steve's earlier point, it's just about distinguishing between whether emissions should be categorized as upstream or downstream in transport and distribution. And I think there can be some confusion there, but taking an example of if you were accounting for emissions from the transport or distribution of a sold product, if your company pays for the transportation of the sold products, say to a retailer, then that falls into the upstream because it's a supplier, the money's going out. If your company is not paying for the transportation of sold products to a retailer, that would be downstream, falling into category 9. So one last slide for me, which is just signposting you. Oh, sorry, actually I have one on one prior to the resources on the next slide, actually, which is just about some examples of approved science-based targets. I won't go through these in detail, but I've italicized the elements that are scope 3, and then I've picked these 3 because they do explicitly mention transport and distribution, and you can kind of see examples of how those different target setting approaches I just previously mentioned are applied in real targets. I'd also recommend going to the Science Based Targets Initiative website, where you can search through all approved targets to look at more examples. And then this is my final slide now, onto the next one, which is really just signposting you to the wide array of resources that are available to support companies as they're setting science-based targets. So highly recommend going through those in detail using the available tools, webinar recordings, FAQ documents on the website. So that's all from me. I'll hand back over to Steve, and happy to take questions in the Q&A session.
Thanks, Olwen. Actually, before you go though, I'd really like to just knock that question from Eugene off, because I think it's quite fundamental. Can you see that basically, is there a risk that only companies with easy carbon reductions will sign up, as a 2-degree reduction seems very optimistic and unlikely to be achieved generally? I'm imagining you have a pretty good sense of how many companies are currently set 1.5 degree science-based targets, and I know for certain that many companies from quite challenging sectors have set targets. So could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on that before we let you go?
Yeah, very happy to. I think no, it's definitely not been that we're just seeing the kind of easy sectors sign up, thankfully. This is partly helped by the fact that the Science Based Targets Initiative has developed sector-specific approaches for some of the heavier industries. So for cement, steel, power generation, there are dedicated pathways available. And so yeah, we have a total of, from targets approved, we have 1,328 targets approved. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe 70% of those are actually 1.5 degree aligned. So more ambitious than a 2 degree or well below 2 degree target. So we are actually seeing really, really good uptake, and we hope it will continue.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks to our audience for already giving us so many interesting questions coming through. I think, Olwen, a lot of them are fairly technical, so I might just ask you to try and maybe do some written answers if you don't mind. But I'm sure that there'll be some that we'll want to come back to in the Q&A later. But now let's move on to Andrew.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to share with you today a little bit about how Nestlé are approaching the decarbonisation of our logistics. So, as you mentioned at the beginning, Steve, I look after the logistics activities for Nestlé within our European region, so principally those transportation activities that are by road, water, train, and to a small degree by air. So within this presentation, relatively short, but I just wanted to focus on two main parts. The first is to share a little bit of our experience in the measurement of the CO2 impact of our Scope 3 transportation activities. And then secondly, to share a bit more on our strategy for decarbonisation, the things that we've done so far, the kinds of things that we're working on at the moment that will realise the reduction into the future. I did want, however, just to leave a small disclaimer before I start. That is, I don't necessarily have all of the answers. I'm not sure anyone has all of the answers yet. So very much we're in the stage of learning together how to tackle this decarbonisation. And for some things we'll get right first time, other things for sure we'll go through some iterations before we find the right way. If you move on to the next slide then, because before we start, it's probably best to set the scene a little bit. Of course, I would imagine that you've heard of Nestlé, and with 1 billion products sold every day, the chances are probably you've consumed a Nestlé product relatively recently too. We manufacture, distribute a very wide range of product categories, from specialist health nutrition products through to many loved brands like Nescafé and Kit Kat. And we have very much a global reach. We sell products in 186 countries and have quite a large manufacturing distribution footprint also, so nearly 400 factories located around the world. And if you go to the next slide, what it really means then is that we have a very significant logistics network. So we have over 900 warehouses around the world. We ship some 4 billion kilometers each year. And of course, that results in a not insignificant carbon footprint. So over 7.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent recorded as part of our 2018 baseline calculation. And of course, it's that footprint that's really the focus of our discussion today. Just a note to mention, because I think it's important as we go through this presentation, is that Nestlé, at Nestlé, we don't really own so many trucks and we certainly don't own boats or trains. So the vast majority of our logistics activities are carried out on our behalf by logistic partners, of which we have many. So just for example, in Europe, we would have contracts with logistics companies, over 500 different logistics companies. And so it's an important element to understand as I go through the presentation, because many of the activities are not in our direct control, neither for the purposes of the measurement or indeed the ability to make the change that's needed. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see Nestlé's ambitions in terms of net zero and our roadmap. And of course, like many companies, we're committed to achieving net zero, in our case, by 2050 across all the aspects of our operations. And that challenge is more for the fact that we also must mitigate the emissions impact of the growth, which we also expect to continue to be strong in the years ahead. We set ourselves some interim commitments: 20% reduction in real terms by 2025, 50% by 2030, I think, as many other companies have done so. And And very much we see that needle has started to turn, and we really see that the peak of our CO2 impact is now behind us. In fact, even in logistics, we've reduced our CO2 emissions by over 10% since the baseline, which of course is a very solid starting point. But the road ahead for sure is going to continue to be challenging. Achieving net zero in logistics will require a complete transformation in the way that the whole industry is operating. A whole new ecosystem will need to evolve to support the different new technologies that will take us to net zero. And I think very much, and I certainly talk a lot to my team in Nestlé about this, that logistics in Europe for me will look completely different by the end of this decade. So there's going to be an enormous amount of change to come. But it's a change that will need us to act. We need to make it happen, and we need to work together as the industry to do that. So if you go to the next slide, and very quickly just to give an overview as to how we are measuring the emissions in transportation. As you can imagine, this is a very complicated topic, particularly for a complex business like ours. And so we've had to develop ways to collect, to normalize and report the data in the most accurate way possible. So in this case, we've created an IT solution that's taking all the information we have, information from internal systems, information from our transportation providers, and we're using that information to then determine through our partners Eco Transit World actually the carbon impact of every single journey, every single delivery that we have to a customer. Eco Transit World are offering a GLEC certified solution, so they are using the different emission factors in different countries, different transport types, etc., in order to calculate that impact. And then that full data set then is available for us as effectively part of a data lake that we can create the right reporting on one hand, but I think even much more importantly for me, we can create the right analytics that supports all of the different projects, the different initiatives that we have, identifying the new areas of opportunity. But if you go to the next slide, there are of course challenges in the measurement, and I'm sure that many others are facing exactly the same things. I just pick out 4 of them here. For instance, we have invisible transport flows, so transport that's not necessarily organized or executed by Nestlé. So an example here might be raw and packaging materials that are coming into factories that we purchase on a delivered basis. We have less visibility of what's happening in the transportation leg. There are many empty kilometers in transportation networks, and this is an important contributor to emissions. Across Europe, roughly 20% of transport kilometers are still empty today. And whilst it will never be possible to completely eliminate them, if we can have visibility of them, it gives us the opportunity to do something. And I'll mention that again in a second. And then the other 2, around the different types of vehicle type, the fuel type, what actually was the vehicle that turned up to the site, what was really the fuel type, was it a biodiesel fuel or was it a fossil diesel fuel? Being able to recognize this information is very, very challenging. And of course, what happens to the transport en route, particularly for those intermodal type loads where part of it is on the road, part of it is on the rail or sea, knowing exactly the route that was taken and where the change in the mode happened is very, very important. I think the point for me on all of this, though, is that we've spent many hours working out how to manage some of this ambiguity, and we finally concluded that really we must start somewhere, and it's best to start with the best information that we have, and that the accuracy of that information then will improve over time. I think if our conclusion is that if we wait for perfection, we'll perhaps delay making the start on the improvements that we need to make, and that is much, much worse. So, for me, that is the key message and learning for us on the measurement side. Then if you go to the next slide, you should see the different areas of focus that we have within Nestlé on improving or moving towards the decarbonisation of logistics. There are 3 parts, basically. The first part is around avoid, and this is really the topic of using the resources that we have more responsibly. So organising our distribution networks in the most efficient way, ensuring that our vehicles are full, trying to minimise the empty kilometres that are driven. The second is the area of shift, and this is about moving from probably more traditional road freight diesel trucks into alternative modes. So minimizing the use of air freight also, and moving into trains or boats that may have a much lower carbon emission. Not always straightforward, of course. Intermodal solutions are not always available when and where they're needed. And each one of these projects brings together many different partners in order to be able to unlock. So I'll share that a little bit more in a second. And then there's the area of improve. And this is really the area of unlocking advanced fuels, zero emission fuels or low emission fuels. So certainly here for us, biofuels is a big topic. The move towards battery electric vehicles, particularly in heavy goods vehicles, the use of hydrogen in the future. And each of these projects is very, very complicated. It must bring together even more different players within a sort of an ecosystem. And hopefully in some of the examples that I'll share, you'll get a sense of the level of collaboration that's required for every single one of these projects to get off the ground. So if you go to the next slide, I give a few more concrete examples within Nestlé. We very much see the avoid area as a short-term opportunity, and certainly much of the improvement we've already realized in the last years has come from this part, and we expect it to be an important contributor, let's say, in the next 5 years or so. And really mainly because it's mostly entirely within our own control. So it doesn't require this huge collaboration of different parties to realize the benefits. So we're focusing on 3 main areas really here, focusing on the product density, making sure that in each shipping case, in each pallet, in each truck, we're able to put the maximum amount of product. We have started really to push this intolerance of empty truck space. So every time we have empty truck space, investigating the reason why we have the empty truck space so that we can learn for the future and improve for the future, particularly here working with customers, also to optimize their orders to fill the capacity that we have available. And then on the third area around inbound and outbound linkages, making sure that this principle of every truck arriving on one of our sites arrives full and then leaves the site full, really trying to address this problem of the empty kilometers and what I mentioned before of 20% of kilometers on the road across Europe roughly being empty. So these are relatively basic concepts, but still lots of opportunity for us to get after still today. In actual fact, one of the main points of this actually is around the changing of the mindset of an organization. And for sure, I see this changing within our company, and I see it changing quickly also across the industry. So then if you go to the next slide, I give some examples around shift. As I mentioned, this is mainly focused on unlocking moves to intermodal or train solutions that are much, much lower in their carbon intensity. So I think the main message that I did want to pass is that they are complicated projects. They do require working very closely with different partners to unlock. We need to find creative solutions. Sometimes we need to make long-term commitments that enable the justification of the investments required. But when they are realized, they do really move the needle in terms of the improvements that they can make. And you can see 2 examples here from our waters business in Europe, one from Italy to Germany with an intermodal solution, and another important one in France of containers moved off the road, 27,000 truck movements moved onto rail, a project that we worked on a year or so ago. Then if we move on to the next slide, the area of improve, here we really make a start, and this is all about the alternative or the advanced fuels. The solutions are complicated, and the way to realize really is collaboration. So if you take, for example, in the top left-hand corner, bio-LNG projects that we've been working on, so biogas projects. And here we've brought together the different players, the truck manufacturers, the biogas manufacturers in the location where the fuel needs to be consumed, the refueling stations, which are often owned by another partner, and of course, most importantly, the logistics provider. In many cases, quite significant investments need to be made by the different partners, different contractual commitments need to be made so that those investments can be recouped. But through this, and if we work it in the right way, we can create effectively zero carbon logistics. Today, we still operate on a relatively small scale for bio-LNG and also for electric and hydrogen, but is something that is accelerating now quite quickly as we find the way to work. And actually, in the case of the biogas, now in Italy, we have around 40 trucks running powered by biogas, taking agricultural waste from local farms and turning it into effectively a zero carbon alternative. We have a similar story for hydrogen. Here is an example from Switzerland where Nestlé have been working with the truck manufacturers, with the third-party logistics operators to unlock 3 zero carbon hydrogen trucks that are now running. And really the story is just at the beginning for heavy duty electric trucks. We have a single electric vehicle that operates in Sweden, but more collaborations coming with the truck manufacturers, with the transport providers, and importantly for electric, of course, very much the infrastructure providers. Okay, and if you go to the next slide, I mean, this is really just to highlight the importance of the collaboration in order to accelerate the progress. So we work with many different green freight programs, and particularly we're very active with GLEC on some of their projects. We work with different governments and NGOs also to help define the legislative framework that helps to unlock the transition. And in particular here, we're very pleased that we were one of the founding members of ECTA, the European Clean Trucking Alliance, and starting to have quite an impact on the legislative framework. We're continuously looking at what others are doing to get ideas and inspiration. In fact, normally I'm a participant in a webinar like this rather than one presenting. It's very rare, but very pleased to do so. But yes, normally listening and looking around outside the window what others are doing, and of course very much working with our different partners, logistics providers, energy providers, truck manufacturers, and so on. And then if you go on to the next slide, there is one point I also wanted to make, is that we have also unlocked a lot of the opportunity, or we plan to unlock a lot of the opportunity in the future, also through the implementation of technology and through driving an organizational change within Nestlé. And that principally is that we implementing what we call transport control towers, or T-hubs as we call them, transport hubs, where we have taken a greater responsibility, particularly for the planning and the execution of transport. And this allows us to have a much closer relationship with the transport that's happening. It gets us better visibility of what's really going on. It gives us the opportunity to do new things more easily and take different opportunities, different creative solutions much more easily. And so this is something we're rolling out globally and have been over the last couple of years. And now in Europe, much of our freight is now managed through 4 of these transportation hubs that are a part of the Nestlé organization. And then if we move on to the final slides, it was just to summarize what I think were the 3 key messages really from me. The first is measurement is absolutely key to the CO2 reduction, but absolutely not to wait until being 100% perfect. Secondly, in the short term, the biggest opportunities are very much through avoiding operational inefficiency. And I think too often it's easy to jump into the alternative fuels and things like that, but actually there are many operational inefficiencies that can be eliminated first. And of course, those longer term opportunities, really, they do require collaboration. And that is absolutely the key message for me, a collaboration that in order to deliver in the future really must start now. And that's it. Thank you. Back to you, Steve. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. That was fabulous. Lots of really interesting points to build out on. I'm going to hold my tongue. Let's wait and hear from Oliver, and then we can get stuck into a conversation. Thanks very much to everyone for all of your fabulous questions. I just want to emphasize how important it is for you to give us those votes now, because I think it's getting ever more unlikely that we're going to be able to get through all of these questions. So do please take a moment, have a scan down the list, and if there's a question that really hits on an issue that's of interest to you, give it a thumbs up, and that will improve the likelihood that we will be able to speak about it. Okay, let's move on to the next slide and on to Oliver, and away we go.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. And Andrew, what an excellent presentation. I think the request for your slides is going to be very, very strong, I suspect. You've explained it extraordinarily well. So I don't want to get too much in the way of the questions that are going to come pouring through. So my name is Oliver Hurrey. I have been running the Scope 3 peer group for the last 2 and a bit years. And I think tantamount to how many people are on this call and how many questions are being asked, Scope 3 is really difficult. It's incredibly complex. It's confusing. It's difficult to know where to go to get good advice, get good guidance. It's extremely challenging. That shouldn't stop you focusing on it and taking action on it, but it does mean that there's a need to go and find really good support. This UN Global Compact series of webinars is phenomenal. It's one of the best I've seen. There's plenty of them, and this sort of resources is really important. But a couple of years ago, a number of different brands were crying on each other's shoulders about how to tackle Scope 3 generally, not just in distribution and transport, but across the board. And so I started convening a group that ended up being grant funded. And because of COVID and everything else, we went on Zoom. There's now 1,000 individuals that meet approximately every 2 months. And we do a lot of crying on each other's shoulder about the challenges of Scope 3 and what to do forward. So what I'm going to share a little bit now is a couple of examples of where you can go to get practical support from each other and from others. And I know Olwen will agree that the SBTi gets absolutely bombarded with emails and questions about, is this the situation? Is that the situation? And so the need for guidance and support is almost completely outweighed by the ability to provide it. So the UNGC, SBTi, and the Scope 3 peer group and many other initiatives are out there, and there's plenty of support that you can get. So we've been meeting for a couple of years, and I just wanted to give you a reflection on some of the key issues. So after 17, 18 meetings, the key themes of the questions that get asked are: how do we engage suppliers? How do we communicate to them? How do we reach them? How do we support them? How do we capability build them? Data and methodology, you could argue, is probably the most often asked questions. How do we collect data? What data do we collect? What methodologies do we use? There's always the question around net zero. So what do we do in this offset world? How do we reach and actually incorporate net zero and offset thinking into Scope 3? That's another very popular topic. But I also want to highlight another one, which is in order to engage your suppliers, you've got to engage your own procurement team. And that is something that often gets forgotten. And that is a particular challenge that's been raised throughout this. And I would encourage everyone to have a look and have a think about how they can engage their procurement colleagues, whether it's for transport and distribution or anything else, and understand how to do that. There are a number of resources globally. You can go to the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, which I also chair, which is a global network of procurement professionals really focused on challenges, not just on Scope 3. There is a Scope 3 chapter to that. I'll put the link in the chat as well. It's completely free support for procurement professionals in procurement language on this challenge. So I'd highly recommend that. But if you're interested in the Scope 3 peer group, there is no cost to it. It's grant funded. It is invite only. We have a number of meetings coming up. You'd be very, very welcome. Very, very happy to send you more details. I'll talk about that in a second. One of the things I wanted to highlight from Andrew's presentation is the 2 points that he made. One is the importance of collaboration, but the sheer number of initiatives that are out there. I mean, there was quite a few on Andrew's slide, and I'm sure Andrew would agree, there is an enormous number of initiatives in transport and distribution for not just Scope 3, but sustainability in general. It can be very difficult to navigate all of that. So I would take the effort to do a bit like Andrew's done, is highlight in a map what initiatives are right for you and have conversations with people like Andrew to discover what's right for you and what works. And I would highlight certainly the ones that he's part of. I'm certainly very aware of and are very good. But that challenge of negotiating initiatives and highlighting where you should be is a key one. I think the other point Andrew raised, which has been an incredibly popular point in the Scope 3 peer group for 2 years, is the paralysis of analysis. It is very easy, because of the complexity of Scope 3 and data and methodologies, to get bogged down in measurement. You could spend another 5 years just trying to work out how you're going to measure without actually making any reductions. One of the key themes in the Scope 3 peer group of retailers and brands globally has been this desire to get the balance between measurement and accuracy and getting on and doing stuff. There is some really good and obvious stuff, as Andrew's highlighted, that you can be doing on your fleet or with your suppliers in general. And getting that balance of action and measurement is critical. There is a danger you find yourself looking at numbers forever and never actually seeing those numbers go down. And that's probably more important. You can access all the recordings of the Scope 3 peer group, a real peer group of initiatives and discussion, all on different topics. If you search on YouTube for Scope 3 peer group, you can actually find that relatively easily. You can also contact me if you'd like more information. You can do that via LinkedIn or my email. So next slide, please. Just a quick highlight on the next meeting that we have. It's on the 19th of May. Pretty much everyone that I speak to, every brand, every retailer wants to know how they as an organization are organized around Scope 3. Is procurement responsible? Is sustainability responsible? How much budget has everybody got for tackling Scope 3? How much engagement have they got? What tools are they using? What platforms are they using? So our next meeting on the 19th of May is going to look at how we can actually understand those answers. How can we actually understand who's making what decisions in what order, so you can get a sense of, when you go to your boss, you can say, well, everyone else is doing it this way. Guidance and information is out there, but sometimes it isn't, and really understanding what your peers are doing is very important. If you'd like to find out more information, you'd all be very welcome, I'm sure, so drop me a line. Next slide, please. Final slide. Just on the topic of indirect spend, so one of the key themes of the Scope 3 peer group has been the challenges of Scope 3 emissions in indirect spend, or goods not for resale, including logistics and warehousing, recycling services, brand and marketing services, even consulting and technology. How do you actually look at emissions reduction in that? So there is actually a project starting in the next month, a 12-month project, specifically helping procurement professionals, not just sustainability professionals, to understand the Scope 3 challenges around emissions reduction opportunities in these particular categories like logistics and transport. You'd be very, very welcome to find out more about that. There'll be insight that will be available for all, regardless of whether you're part of the project or not, that will be coming out of that. And as I said, very happy to make sure that you get that. If you'd be interested in joining that initiative or helping your procurement team to get more information on that, again, please do get in touch. But as I said, indirect spend categories like logistics, packaging, recycling, sometimes they can get forgotten. Not just in emissions either, human rights issues as well, because there's often a focus, arguably too much, but understandably so, on direct materials, products and services. And it is these indirect spend categories that sometimes can get forgotten, where there's amazing opportunities to make emissions reduction opportunities. So don't discount them, and it's great to see the UNGC focusing on that. Enough from me. I think we should tackle those questions, or certainly the team should.
Thanks very much, Oliver. Some great additional resources there for people to get further stuck in. Wow, lots of questions. Let's get going right away. This first one, I think I'm going to have to steer it back to you, Olwen, and maybe we want to put that slide back up. From Joe, can you clarify the difference between category 4 and category 9? And I see Mathilde further down is also seeking some more clarity around this. So I know the slide was aligned with what Mathilde is saying, so I'm not sure where the confusion has come in, but maybe Olwen, do you want to maybe elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, sure, happy to. I think it's probably important to think that category 4, so upstream transportation and distribution, actually generally encompasses more of the emissions than you might think. So what category 4 encompasses is transport and distribution of any products that you've purchased in that year. But from your suppliers, so the transport and distribution of those products from your tier 1 suppliers to you, and then also it includes any third-party transport or distribution services that you purchase, and that includes both inbound and outbound logistics. But if you purchase them, so that's why it's about the money flow. If your company purchases them, then they're category 4 upstream. So it's not so much the differentiation isn't between inbound and outbound, but it's between the transaction of money. Because then category 9 is just the transport and distribution of sold products, so only after the point of sale, how things are transported. So that's the key distinction there. But I would also direct you, the GHG Protocol Scope 3 corporate standard has very comprehensive descriptions, has some examples in there, and I'd point you to that as the source of truth.
Thanks, Olwen. I think we're going to leave it there. There's loads of resources to get more clarity. And the question from Paul, well, part 2 of the question from Paul has generated lots of interest. So first, let me just read out part 1, which requires a little bit of scrolling down. There it is. So we are a distributor, manufacturer, and retailer. So we have a large number of products being delivered from Europe and also from the Far East, i.e. upstream, and then have a larger number of products being distributed downstream via multiple different carrier types. We've engaged with suppliers and carriers and also our own IT team to start digitally recording the data. But more importantly, and I presume the million-dollar question is, and now I gotta scroll back up to the top, what recommendations do the panel have in reducing emissions from upstream and downstream carriers without having a detrimental commercial impact in terms of timescales and costs? So, Andrew, you've kindly
volunteered at least to start with the little bit of the answer. I mean, firstly, I would pick up on the point, and I don't know your situation, Paula, specifically, but certainly when we were looking at this in Nestlé, and as I mentioned a bit in the presentation, there are opportunities, operational efficiency opportunities that have a reduction in CO2 and also either don't cost anything or even bring a cost saving. And principally, that's about making sure that we use the assets, the resources that we have more efficiently. So effectively filling the truck. If you have to use a truck and that truck has a certain CO2 footprint, if you like, then make sure that we use it more efficiently. And honestly, I think most people think, at least in our organization, my experience is that most people think that those assets are well utilized. And in reality, they're not. If you remember the picture on my slide of the box of, I think it was soup sachets, and when you turn the box on the end and 25% of the box is empty, I don't think anyone had any idea that that was the case. But if you can fit 25% more product in the box, then you can fit 25% more product on the truck. And if you fit 25% more product on the truck, you've effectively reduced your carbon footprint by 25%, and it's cost you nothing. In fact, it's better than cost you nothing. It's made a contribution. Now, when you get into the alternative fuels or the different technologies, here it is a bit more complicated, particularly for the time being. Many of those technologies are more expensive. Not always, and I think certainly one of the examples here is about the switch to biofuels. Your biofuels are not necessarily or do not necessarily have the same cost base as fossil fuels, and certainly with the high oil prices that we have today, that differential, that on cost is much lower or even not there at all. Now, I would say it very much depends on the legislation within different countries, and certainly one of the things that we have been doing is watching the different legislative frameworks, the different taxation frameworks in different countries to prioritize our efforts, let's say, where that on cost for those additional technologies is less. But certainly in the short term, yes, some of those more complicated or more involved projects are bringing an additional cost. However, I would say that the lines will cross at a certain point. The fossil fuel alternatives will become more expensive over time. If you take electric trucks, for instance, they will become much cheaper over time. I'm not entirely sure when the lines will cross, and I think it will be different country by country depending on the legislative frameworks, but at a certain point those lines will cross, and I think the trick here is also trying to anticipate that, because then also you will not have that same commercial challenge. So my advice here would be to start with really the basic operational efficiency aspects, because I'm fairly sure that you'll find things that you never realized were the case if you really go and see with your own eyes and look into it. And I'll tell you, my phone is absolutely full of photographs of when I walk around distribution centers and see these opportunities, and I share them with the team constantly.
There were some comments earlier that I think suggested, comments in the chat box. You described these as basic steps, and that almost, I suppose, that creating the impression that these are things that are easy to fix. And I think really I would want to put it out there. I know from speaking to many companies that decarbonizing logistics is one of the biggest challenges that they face. And although it seems simple and obvious, fill the truck, there's a lot more to it and competing pressures. I think
I would say though, sorry on that, I would say simpler. I think just to make sure I'm not misconceived in that sense, because no, absolutely, they're not easy things. There are competing pressures. Absolutely, I completely agree with you, but they are simpler than some of the alternatives that we have that are going to take longer to make the progress on. So I think we have to tackle those at the same time as starting the journey with the more complicated projects.
In tackling them, typically there's going to need to be some investment in capacity or maybe even capital expenditure. Would you apply? Is the company looking at the same ROI on investments of that type as perhaps in other investments? I mean, I'm trying to, again, referring back to the comments from earlier, looking at a balance between the carbon impact and the bottom line, and whether that carbon impact is starting to get a little more weighted in the decision-making process, or are they getting aligned with an internal carbon price or some other mechanism?
No, I think there is a general acceptance, at least in our organization, that investments in some of these sustainability initiatives have a much longer return on investment, but they're also critically important strategically and for the future of the business and the industry overall. So no, I think there is a general acceptance that some of these will take longer. If you take your investment in electric trucks, I mean, you have the huge charging infrastructure investment that also needs to be put in place now. Okay, this may be privately funded if you're installing it on your site, maybe through a collaboration with a charging network or something. But one way or the other, there is a significant investment, and the trucks are much more expensive. An electric truck is typically maybe 4 or 5 times more expensive than a diesel truck. It's taking many years before you find that break-even point, and years much longer than we would otherwise expect from investments in, let's say, manufacturing assets and so on. So no, there's not a set rule that if a manufacturing investment is quicker, then we prioritize that over sustainability. No, absolutely not. It's a much more holistic approach in that sense.
Thanks, Andrew. We are running out of time, and I'm really sorry about that. And apologies to Oliver and Olwen that I haven't brought you in, but I'm going to actually, the next top question is also for Andrew, and I think it's a really important one to talk about the data. So if I may just urge you, Oliver and Olwen, to go wild, because this is going to be the last question we're going to be able to answer live. If there's anything below that where you feel you could put something into a written answer, that would be really appreciated. And Andrew, if I may, that question from Tom Sharp: how are you gathering data on inbound supplier logistics, especially when this data is not directly in your systems or directly under your control? Could you help us out with that?
Yeah, we haven't fixed the problem completely yet, but the plan to fix it is that we are, in all of our sites, implementing an IT solution for the registration of any vehicle that's arriving. And for those vehicles that are arriving with warm packaging materials and so on, we are, which I think is what this question is relating to, we are gathering information at the point of arrival at the site as to where the vehicle came from and reconciling that with where we believe it came from with the order that we placed with the supplier, what type of vehicle it is, what type of fuel it is that it is driving. It's in still early days, and over the course of this year and into next year, we're rolling this solution out across the site so that we have a better way of being able to report. But today, yeah, in some cases, it is very much, I think, the issue that Tom is describing, that it's very difficult to see, at least to know where the goods came from, and to have an idea of the vehicle type, at least is getting us much more accurate information. And then it links to my point before, because the more information we have on the vehicles that are arriving, the more opportunity we have to link them with a vehicle that's departing. Then you take the empty kilometers away, then you're making a significant improvement again on the in the CO2 footprint. And this is why we see it as very important, not just from a reporting perspective, but for identifying the opportunities too. Fabulous.
Well, now we really are out of time. There's a couple more slides to come just for me to share about some of our upcoming activities. That so while that's coming up, though, huge thank you to Olwen, Andrew, and Oliver for your contributions today. Really appreciated. Great insights that you've shared. Thank you to the audience for your active engagement and all the fantastic questions. We will be sharing the recording and a key takeaways document, and we'll do our best to knock off some more of the questions in that document before we send it around to you. Some upcoming activities from the Global Compact Network UK are on screen. We've got for our smaller companies in the audience, we're doing an event with Bays about the SME Climate Hub, some examples of good practice there. We'll hear from some small companies that have set net zero targets and how they're working through that, and the fabulous support available through the SME Climate Hub. Our business and human rights team are doing a webinar series on Pride Plus, building LGBTIQ plus inclusive business, and the next session in that series is next week. We hope you'll be able to join us for that. Next slide, please. The next session in this series is going to be on the 12th of May, and we're going to be looking at waste-related emissions. And we're going to have a talk about maybe making the session longer so that we can get through more questions. So we'll maybe watch this space for that. And another series that we've got running in the climate space that I think would be really valuable, Climate and Human Rights, Building Resilience for Business. We'll be looking at vulnerable communities and how that can create vulnerable businesses, and all linking into the just transition and the importance of taking a more holistic view of your climate action. Is there another slide? No, there's not. So with that, once again, a huge thank you to Owen Mumford, PA Consulting, and Shoesmiths for their support of this series. Big thanks again to our speakers and to our audience and to the team. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.